Hi, my name is Debbie, and I am here to talk to you about talking to your kids about the dangers of alcohol and keeping them from drinking alcohol until they're 21. I have some very good reasons for doing that, and I wish I had done that when my oldest son had just graduated from high school. There's a lot of happy memories that I have of my kids growing up. One of them was when I was delivering my second child. My son Casey was at home sitting by the front window, and he finally fell asleep, and people took pictures of him, and it was the cutest little thing waiting for us to get home with his new baby brother. And then I remember seeing him out on the lawnmower with my dad. Casey was the first grandchild that we had on my side of the family, and my dad just adored him. They would Dad would put him in front of him on the riding lawnmower, and they would just go back and forth over the 2.5 acres that they were mowing together. There's a lot of pictures that I have over holidays. My dad holding my youngest son on his lap with Casey sitting on a counter, and they're just laughing, laughing, laughing. Those pictures, a lot of the times, I look at them and they make me smile, but then on the other hand, they also kind of bring a tear to the back of my throat, because I always wonder what it would have been like to have Casey be there and part of the family. Now let me tell you a little bit about Casey. He was an honor roll student every semester that he was in high school. He played the tuba in the marching band. He sang in the choir. He also was a member of the football team. So at halftime at the football games, he would take off his shoulder pads and he would pick up his tuba and go out onto the field with the marching band and play, whatever they were playing that day. And then when that was over, he would put his shoulder pads back on and join the football team. Now there's not too many people that would do that or be accepted for doing that. And Casey was one of those. I always tried to teach him as he was growing up that there was always something you could do to make a friend out of someone. I said, sometimes they aren't very nice to you because they just don't know how to be nice. They don't know what it's like to be a friend. And so I always told Casey, I said, try and be a friend to them. Show them what it's like to be a friend. And then growing up, I always told him, I said, whatever you do, you don't want to ever drink and drive. If you ever find yourself someplace and you've had too much to drink, all you have to do is call me and I'll come and get you. And if there's a problem, we'll have a talk about it the next morning, but we won't argue about it on the way home that night. And so that was something that I always said to both of my kids is don't ever drink and drive. But something that I never considered was, what was he seeing his parents do? Was he seeing his parents consume alcohol in a responsible manner? No, not always. He didn't always see us doing that. we apparently too often did not set a very good example. I always tried to make sure that a sober driver drove us home from when we were off visiting friends and stuff, but I don't know that we necessarily set a good example. So, and then a friend pointed out to me that by telling Casey that if he ever found himself drinking someplace and needed a safe ride home, to call me, that was kind of giving him permission to drink underage. And that isn't anything that I wanted to do. In Casey's senior year, he had an accident on the trampoline and ended up having surgery on his ankle. And so he spent the last couple months of his senior year on crutches, but he kind of liked it because he got to use the elevator at the school, and he could pick a friend of his to help him along if he needed to. So he got off crutches just right before graduation, which is in May. And everybody was there for graduation. Had parties, lots of fun. Casey was happy. And what he wanted for part of his graduation present was to go back east and visit my brother, who lived in Maine. And so after he graduated, he flew back to Maine and visited with my two nieces back there and my brother and his wife. And when that was over, he flew back home. I drove to Denver and picked him up, and we drove home. And in the meantime, he had been invited to move into a friend of his trailer. And so they did. And I wasn't quite ready to let go of those wings yet, but I did. I decided, he is a smart kid. I think I've taught him everything that he needs to know. So, and he wasn't very far from where I lived and where he was moving into. So he moved in there, and every Saturday we would have a family breakfast up at a restaurant that was just up the street. And that a particular Saturday morning, which would have been Saturday, July 13th, we had breakfast, finished breakfast. He went outside and sat on, he had an old Cadillac car that he loved and hated at the same time. Loved it because it was a Cadillac. Hated it because he had to keep doing repairs on it. But that's okay because it was still a Cadillac. So he climbed up on the hood and leaned back against the windshield and was kind of bathing in the sunlight. And we all came out and we said our goodbyes. And I don't specifically remember everything I said to him, but I'm hoping that I told him that I loved him and that I would see him later. And so a little bit later, he went to work at the restaurant that he worked for. He was a cook at the restaurant. And so he had the late shift. He worked until they closed. And at that time, there was the fair and rodeo was in town. So they decided to go to the carnival grounds and, walk through, just have some chat, find a lot of friends that they knew, maybe ride a few rides. And then when that was over, they decided to do a party at Casey and his roommate's house. And so on the way home, somebody stopped at a liquor store on the way home and bought some alcohol. Now, granted, they shouldn't have been able to, because number one is nobody at that party was over 21. But the liquor establishment did sell them liquor. And so they proceeded to go to the trailer and they started the party. And then somebody thought that it'd be lots of fun to have somebody chug as much alcohol as they could. And then, you know, they would watch and have their little laughs and giggles. And then, you know, I never would have dreamed that Casey would have done something like that, because I thought I had taught him not to drink that much alcohol. But then it occurred to me, like, why wouldn't he feel like he was safe? Because he was at his own house. He had what he thought were friends surrounding him. He thought that once he got tired, that he could go to bed and not have to worry about anything. And so the next morning, the roommate kept calling my house. It started like at 8 o'clock, 8:15 in the morning. It was a Sunday morning. And he kept asking for my younger son, who was 16 years old. And I kind of laughed at him and I said, well, he's not up yet. It's Sunday morning. What are you thinking? He says, okay, thanks. Just tell him that I called when he gets up. And so, okay. So he called another 4 times. And every time he would say, tell him I called when he gets up. And so as soon as my younger son, Chris, got up, I told him that they had been calling. And Chris says they probably are just anxious to go out to the lake, Mom. And so he hopped in the shower and then hopped in his truck and headed up to his brother's house. At the same time, a police officer was on her way to my house. She had drawn the short straw. She knocked on my door and I answered the door and I saw her standing there. And the first thing I thought of was that they had gone out the night before and had done something stupid like stealing a stop sign, or maybe they had had a little fender bender with somebody and didn't stop and leave their information and stuff. And so I let the police officer in and she looked at me and she said, is there anyone else in the house? And I said, no. I said, my younger son just is driving up to his older brother's house right now. And she said, well, I need you to sit down. And then, of course, you get that sad, that feeling at the pit of your stomach that you think, okay, what's going on? She, as soon as I sat down, she, of course, uttered those words that no parent ever wants to hear. I'm sorry to inform you that your son Casey has died. There's never any way, easy way to say that, never. And so at that time, I kind of felt cloudy. I didn't really know what was going on. I thought, what does she mean? And then she asked me, is there somebody we can call to come out here and be with you? And I thought, well, I can call my dad. And she says, okay, why don't you call him and ask him to come out here right away? Don't tell him what has happened. Just ask him to come out here. And so as soon as my dad got there, I sat down and I didn't know how to tell him that his first grandchild had died. I didn't know what the circumstances were because the police officer told me that it was an active crime scene and that she couldn't give me too many more details. So she gave me her business card. She gave me a business card for the county coroner. And my dad was sitting there. He didn't know what to do because I'm sitting there crying, of course. And he, of course, his heart was broken too. Neither one of us could believe what had happened. So the police informed my ex-husband. They got a hold of him and informed him. And then it was very soon that Casey's classmates started to come over to the house. The word had already gotten out that Casey had died. Some of them knew kind of what was happening because they had been to the party. And when the coroner finally did get a hold of me a couple days later with what he could tell me, they told me that about the drinking of the alcohol, and as soon as Casey had finished bottles, he would put his signature on them. The coroner told me that Casey had consumed a fifth and a pint of Captain Morgan's spiced rum. He told me that Casey's blood alcohol level at the time of his death was a 0.45. The roommate had told him that as soon as they kind of got tired of watching Casey stumble around and not sure what to do with him, they put him in his own bed. And the roommate did know enough to keep checking in on him, but then he didn't know what to do. So he kept calling my house to ask my 16-year-old son what he should be doing, instead of talking to me about what was going on, because he didn't want me to tell his mom what had happened at the house. He didn't want to get in trouble for consuming the alcohol. And then it was just that cloud that everyone feels. I don't really remember a lot of what happened over probably the first month, but I remember having to meet with a funeral home to plan a funeral. And I'm here to tell you that you don't ever want to do that. if I had just talked to Casey about not drinking when he was in high school, maybe I could have prevented what happened. I'm not positive about it, but I know that when Casey would go out on Friday and Saturday nights, I was always up when he came home. And he never appeared to be drunk. And he would tell me about friends that he had that he was concerned about because they were drinking too much and he was afraid that they were developing a problem. And so I just told him, just be their friend, Casey. That's the best you can do, is just be their friend. And so meeting with the funeral home, picking out clothes that I thought that he would want to wear, and then notifying people of what had happened. I remember Casey's dad coming over and trying to comfort me, but him comforting me and me trying to comfort him, it's something that nobody ever wants to go through. I can promise you that. There's that saying from Rose Kennedy, time heals all wounds. And I can promise you that it doesn't. There's so much that we can prevent by just talking to our kids, by having that conversation with them. It was later that fall, after Casey had died in July, that my younger son, his school was having a presentation put on by MAD, and that one with the big video screens that people would come, the students would all come and see. And my son came to me and he says, "Mom, I really don't think I can sit through this." And so I told him he didn't need to. But I decided that I was going to go and sit through it. And I sat kind of at the back of the gym, and I watched the video presentation, and then the lady who happened to be the MAD director for Wyoming at the time had a couple of speakers who came up, and then after that was done, I went to her and talked to her and told her a little bit about my story. And then she asked if I would be interested in helping her do some victim impact panels here in Wyoming. And I said yes, because I thought maybe that was a good way to try and help other parents to not experience the tragedy that I did. And then it was, we went to one of the MAD conventions in Washington, D.C. And at that time, they were just starting the power of parents with the power of youth. And somehow, I'm not really sure how, but they had heard my story and asked me if I would be interested in sharing my story with the power of parents. And I said, yes, absolutely I would. And so they had a brochure book that they put part of Casey's story in it. It did kind of help, But then I was also given the opportunity to share my story at the next MAD convention. And I met up at that time with Helen Whitty, who happens to be the MAD president at the present time. And we just kind of clicked. She had lost her daughter to an underage drinker and someone who was also consuming marijuana. And with me losing my son Casey to the overindulgence of alcohol, we just kind of bonded. Our kids were close to the same age, and it just felt right that we could be there for each other. And that is when I became more involved with the power of parents. And I want to share this story to try and tell parents that the best thing that you can do is to talk to your kids. Explain to them how it's best if they'll wait until they're 21, because a youth doesn't achieve full brain power until they're in their 20s. And so what better way to get your best brain power than to wait for you being older and more responsible. You'll be able to maybe make better decisions, because let's face it, there's a lot of adults in this world who consume alcohol and don't make the best decisions. And so you can point out to your child about some of the good decisions that they can be making. And especially with a lot of states now having, marijuana stores, and even though you're supposed to be 21 to be able to purchase and smoke marijuana in the states that have somewhat legalized it, that doesn't mean that always works, does it? Because our youth are still consuming alcohol. They still can acquire marijuana. And even adults nowadays are thinking that there's nothing wrong with getting behind the wheel of a car after you've been smoking pot. Back in the day, that's what we all thought. We all thought that we were all safe to get behind that wheel. And we had friends who died. We had friends who were in crashes, who spent a lot of time in hospitals trying to recover. And we just didn't really connect. We didn't realize that the best thing to do is to prevent it for as long as you can. Wait until you're 21. There was a reason that the legal drinking age had been rose to 21, because then more people could prevent tragedies like happened to my son or happened to Helen Whitty's daughter. Because I've spoke to a lot of people here in Wyoming, and a lot of families have gone through tragedies because their underage drinking person just wasn't able to maintain a sober ride. So many tragedies that families have had to go through, burying their grown kids, their husbands, their wives, even their grandmothers, their grandfathers. I wish that back when Casey was in high school and I found that bottle of alcohol and hidden in the garage, I wish I had brought it inside. I wish that I had had a conversation with him. I wish I had reminded him how concerned he was about his friends who were drinking too much. There's just a lot of things that I wish I would have handled a little bit differently that could have prevented this tragedy from happening.